Let me tell you what Ibrahim Traoré is doing. He has launched massive agricultural projects. Burkina Faso is in the middle of a farming boom right now, all thanks to this powerful African leader. He just passed a law that any woman who gives birth gets her medical bills completely wiped out. That's right. It's free to go to the doctor and have a child in Burkina Faso because mothers and maternal care matter. Donald Trump, look at this man. Be like him. Don't be like Zelensky. Don't be a worm. Be a leader like Ibrahim Traoré. A shocking scene just unfolded in New York. Protesters began chanting the name of an African military leader, Ibrahim Traoré, as they marched against Trump. But why him? Why now? And what does it say about the future of global resistance? Let's find out. What started as a single name on a cardboard sign became a full-blown political phenomenon. In less than 48 hours, Traoré was no longer just a name known. In Burkina Faso, or by Sahel watchers, his name was echoing in the streets of the world's most powerful nation. But this wasn't hype. It wasn't random. This was a cry from people hungry for something real, for authentic leadership. Ibrahim Traoré's rise to icon status in the U.S. didn't happen because Americans suddenly cared about West African politics. It happened because they saw something in him they no longer saw in their own leaders: moral clarity. At a time when trust in government is collapsing, when both sides seem obsessed with power, not principle, Traoré stood out. Not because he pandered, but because he refused to. When he became president in 2022, he didn't give flowery speeches. He didn't beg for applause. He declared war on dependency, both military and economic. He expelled French forces. He rejected IMF loans with strings attached. He built homegrown systems, food, transport, and self-reliance. He refused to be treated like a charity case by the West. These weren't just policies. They were acts of rebellion, symbolic breaks from the post-colonial script the West forced African nations to follow. But Americans didn't just see defiance. They saw a blueprint, a way out of the apathy, corruption, and disillusionment they're drowning in. Especially for Black Americans, the sight of a young African leader standing tall against empires felt like reclamation. For decades, they'd been fed two lies: that Africa is only about suffering, and that real leadership means compromise. Traoré shattered both. He showed the world that a Black man in power can be strategic, militant, honest, and wildly popular without Western approval. Then the first viral videos hit. A clip of Traoré in military fatigues, calmly telling reporters, "We are not here to beg for survival. We are here to reclaim our dignity." It hit TikTok like a grenade. Black creators began stitching that clip with footage of U.S. protests, police brutality, food insecurity, gentrification. The message was loud and clear. He may be in Africa, but he's speaking for us. Soon after, digital artists created posters of Traoré's face over civil rights murals. He became a proxy for a conversation no one dared to speak out loud. What if true leadership only exists outside the system? What made it even more powerful? Traoré didn't do a single interview with American media. He didn't try to win over a Western audience. And that silence, that lack of PR gloss, made him even more magnetic. In a world full of political theater, he felt raw, untouched. And that rawness? It drew people in. There's something else that hit home. His age, mid-30s, made him feel like one of us, not a billionaire, not a lifeless bureaucrat, not a corporate puppet, just a young soldier who came from the streets and rose up with purpose. And to the protesters, that made all the difference. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about a feeling that something had been taken from the people, their voice, their power, their future. And somehow, this man had the guts to take it back. In doing so, he became more than a president. He became a mirror, a symbol of what leadership looks like when it grows out of struggle, not privilege. So when American protesters chanted his name, they weren't just admiring a foreign leader. They were calling for a different kind of power, one that doesn't bow, doesn't beg, and doesn't break. What took this movement from admiration to action was what came next. The slogans, the chants, the street visuals that flooded America's largest cities. That's where we go next. But first, let's pause and say a big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Now let's continue. It started quietly. Just a few posters held high, drawn in thick marker by college students and community organizers. But within days, the name Traoré was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. In Los Angeles, a group of young activists formed a human chain outside the federal building, holding signs that read, "Burkina Faso rises while America sleeps." Another read, "Traoré stood, so should we." In Atlanta, where the weight of civil rights history still lingers in the air, marchers carried massive banners painted by hand. A portrait of Traoré, his military beret, his intense gaze, his unshakable calm. Beneath it, 3 words, "We remember Sankara." But it wasn't just the image, it was the emotion behind it. His defiance had become their defiance. In protests against Trump's immigration bans, against rising police brutality, and against the deepening racial wealth divide, Traoré had been cast, not by himself, but by the people, as a vessel of rebellion. Crowds roared, "Hands off Traoré, hands off Africa." This wasn't performative, it was prophetic. Soon, art collectives began designing high-resolution stencils of Traoré's silhouette, spray-painted in bold black across the walls of Harlem, Oakland, and even Miami. His face appeared on stickers slapped on subway trains, benches, traffic poles, next to slogans like "Build like Traoré," "The revolution wears a beret." This is what dignity looks like, and then came the slogans that cut the deepest. Not just praising Traoré, but shaming the American political elite. Trump fears what Traoré represents. Even the digital space wasn't spared. TikTok edits set to protest anthems began circulating, juxtaposing Traoré's speeches with clips of American poverty, housing injustice, and police crackdowns. By this point, Traoré's image had broken through the cultural firewall. It wasn't just students anymore. Celebrities began retweeting his quotes. Musicians shouted him out on stage. Authors referenced him in essays. But what shook the establishment wasn't the volume, it was the depth. These weren't surface-level gestures. They were a cry for a new standard, a demand for leadership that looks, sounds, and fights for the people. The slogans weren't romantic, they were strategic. The streets weren't just expressing grief, they were expressing instructions. The protests became classrooms. The slogans became history lessons. And through it all, Traoré became the lens through which Americans, especially Black and immigrant communities, re-examined their broken systems. But the movement didn't stop at visuals and chants. As momentum grew, the political ripple effects began hitting Washington. The very system that once ignored African resistance now found itself under comparison. In closed-door briefings, intelligence analysts flagged a curious trend. An African military leader had become a central symbol in U.S. protests. For a country that long ignored African politics, unless there were resources to grab or wars to start, this was not just unexpected. It was embarrassing. Trump's carefully curated narrative, of strong borders, a secure America, and dominance over problematic nations was being ripped apart by a man he never planned to talk about. Traoré was never supposed to be part of the story. But now he was the story. And the worst part? He didn't even have to lift a finger. While Trump's team scrambled to justify adding 25 African countries to the visa ban expansion, protesters flooded Capitol Hill with petitions. Congressional offices were swamped with calls demanding clarity. Why are we banning nations for building their own futures? Why are we targeting Africans who are doing what America claims to respect: independence, order, and strength? This wasn't just optics. This was ideological exposure. Trump's policies were being held up against a living, breathing example of what true leadership looks like in the eyes of the people. And the contrast was brutal. Oh, make America great again. Protesters started asking a sharper question. If greatness means sanctions, bans, and bullying, then why does Traoré look more like a liberator than our own president? Traoré had become more than just a name. He was now a measuring stick, a point of comparison so damning that even centrist Democrats stood awkwardly silent when confronted by questions like, why do we fund military bases in Africa but ignore their homegrown leaders? Why does our media cover African coups more than African innovation? Why are we banning people from the very nations we helped to stabilize? It was a rare reversal of roles. An African leader becoming the mirror in which the Western world could see its own failure. And as Trump scrambled to regain control of the narrative, one truth had already locked itself in the minds of thousands. Traoré didn't just reject foreign control in Africa, he exposed its hypocrisy in America. But the story doesn't end there. As this resistance grew deeper, it awakened something even bigger. A Pan-African consciousness, stretching across continents. The next wave wasn't just protest. It was identity. Quick reminder, if you're finding this powerful, please like, share, and subscribe for more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Now, let's continue. By the time Traoré's name had been shouted through megaphones and painted on protest murals, something more profound had begun to stir, not in the White House, but deep in the minds of the diaspora. What began as a political message was now turning into cultural ignition. For many African Americans and first-generation immigrants, this wasn't about foreign policy anymore. This was personal. Traoré had become a bridge across generations. For decades, Black Americans were taught, explicitly and subtly, that Africa was distant, chaotic, and tragic. Schoolbooks focused on famine and war. Hollywood fed them images of poverty and helplessness. News cycles only lit up during coups or crises. The result? A psychological separation, a belief, even among descendants of the enslaved, that Africa was something to mourn, not mirror. But Traoré shattered that narrative. Here was a young, unapologetically African leader who didn't fit any Western mold. He wasn't begging the IMF. He wasn't bowing at G7 summits. He didn't wear the polished smiles of diplomats trained by colonial systems. He wore fatigues, fire, and focus. And he spoke a language of dignity, not dependency. For the diaspora, especially Black Americans raised on the stories of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and Fred Hampton, Traoré was something they hadn't seen in decades. A reflection of Black power that didn't ask permission. That's when community centers and grassroots hubs began shifting focus. In Detroit, a youth group scrapped its usual Black History Month curriculum and held a new workshop titled From Sankara to Traoré, Africa's Resistance Never Died. Young Black Americans began calling themselves Children of Sankara, descendants of Traoré, not just as metaphors but as identity. The Pan-African flame, once smothered by centuries of division, had caught fire again. Even in the digital space, this awakening took shape. Black artists redesigned African flags with American color palettes. Diaspora influencers launched series comparing African governance models to broken U.S. institutions. Pages once dedicated to Black Lives Matter started including updates on the AEs, the Alliance of Sahel States. Hashtags like #DUCTIO and #ReclaimAfrica, #Diaspora2Dignity trended right alongside Traoré's name. But perhaps the most powerful change was this: people stopped seeing Africa as a place that needed saving and started seeing it as a place that had solutions. No longer was Burkina Faso just one of the world's poorest countries. Now it was the country that built 500 electric buses without foreign aid. It was the nation that told France to leave and still stood tall. It was the land whose leader inspired protest slogans in Harlem and Houston. This was no longer admiration. This was reclamation. The African diaspora in America had long struggled to connect with the continent in a way that felt real, not ceremonial. But now, with Traoré's rise, they had something tangible. Not just a leader, but a direction. Not just nostalgia, but a new mission: to restore the broken ties between continents, not through institutions, but through shared resistance. And that resistance? It wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was practical, political, powerful. The final question now that the chants have echoed, the murals are painted, and the diaspora is beginning to wake up. Where does this all lead? Ibrahim Traoré never campaigned for global admiration. He never asked to become a symbol, a political weapon wielded in foreign protests. But symbolism doesn't ask for permission. And like it or not, he now carries something that can't be undone. In the minds of many, he's no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He's become the face of possibility in a world suffocating in political fraud. But now comes the harder part. What do we do with that possibility? Across the U.S., protest organizers are beginning to ask sharper, more grounded questions. Can Traoré's defiance be translated into local action? Can communities in Baltimore, St. Louis, or Oakland take cues from Burkina Faso's local production model and reject corporate dependence? Can schools in black neighborhoods teach African governance, not just slavery and civil rights? Some are already trying. In Chicago's South Side, a cooperative is launching an urban agriculture pilot inspired by Burkina Faso's food independence strategy. In Brooklyn, a Pan-African film festival is rebranding its lineup to showcase modern African leadership instead of recycled colonial trauma. In Atlanta, a grassroots initiative is launching a Traoré study series exploring what post-aid economics might look like in American inner cities. This shift in mindset is profound. For the first time in decades, African Americans aren't just reacting to trauma. They're borrowing strategy from strength. The relationship with Africa is no longer paternal or abstract. It's tactical, intentional, even political, and the ripple is growing. Candidates running for city council and local office in urban centers across the U.S. are referencing Africa, not as a victim, but as a model. One progressive candidate in Minneapolis made headlines saying, "We don't need Wall Street. We need what Traoré has, control over our food, our energy, and our land." It's a seismic cultural pivot, and it's terrifying the establishment. Western policymakers, long used to viewing Africa as a charity case, are now scrambling to understand how a young African military leader became a guiding star for Western protest movements. Think tanks have started warning of ideological contagion, a term once reserved for revolutionary Latin America. But they're right to be worried, because this isn't just protest. This is a philosophical rebellion. And it's asking a question the U.S. elite have no answer for. If a poor, sanctioned African nation can fight for its people without apology, why can't the richest country in the world? Traoré's example exposes the hypocrisy embedded within Western liberal democracies. This idea that change must be slow, negotiated, and always respectful to those in power. But Traoré didn't wait for permission. He didn't write polite letters. He acted, and in doing so, he's inspired a generation tired of waiting. But there's a danger here too, because symbolism without structure fades. If this awakening around Traoré becomes just another trend, flattened into t-shirts, Instagram quotes, and viral moments, it will dissolve like all the others. That's why organizers, educators, and thinkers are emphasizing institutional memory, not just remembering what Traoré did, but understanding how he did it, not just praising him, but replicating him. In essence, the future of this movement rests on one question: can admiration become application? Because if it can, then we're not just witnessing a cultural moment. We're witnessing the birth of a global shift, a world where leadership isn't defined by geography or GDP, but by clarity, courage, and community. A world where Burkina Faso doesn't follow the world follows Burkina Faso. These protests may have started as outrage against Trump, but what they revealed was a hunger far deeper, a hunger for sovereignty, for connection, for heroes who don't sell out. And maybe, just maybe, that hunger is about to reshape not just American politics, but the very balance of global power. Your turn. Do you think it's a big deal that an African leader's name is being chanted in Western protests? Let us know in the comments. Want to see more videos like this? Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a drop. We're creating content on Black culture, history, civilization, and evidence of the glory that's been hidden for far too long. Thanks for watching. And until the next video, stay tuned.